On this episode of the show, I have with me Troy Astorino. He is co-founder and CTO at PicnicHealth, and we're going to be talking about, well, data collection. In this specific case, uniform record collection. Obviously, within healthcare, there's a lot of data issues that people are aware of, and we're going to talk to Troy about how they're tackling this problem, applying AI. There's a lot of volume, and obviously accuracy is of paramount importance in this space, and we're going to dive into some of the model talk as well. Hopefully, if we have some time. Troy, thanks for taking the time to join the show.
Thanks, Amir. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. Before we start, can you tell everyone what PicnicHealth does?
So PicnicHealth uses AI to pull together medical records to make them more useful in improving patient care. And we do that in two main ways. We have a product directly for patients to get all of their records in one place and to share with their doctors, their caregivers, to follow along in their care. And then we do that as well for clinical research. So in particular for observational research, enabling patients to participate in studies and trials to better understand disease progression and treatment efficacy, with the goal of getting better treatments to patients in the real world.
Absolutely. I guess let's start off at the top to make sure everyone is. I think we've all heard that records data within the healthcare system is a challenge, but I guess before we dive into how we're solving it, maybe let's just talk about what those challenges are and why we need something like AI to come in to help.
So it's actually something that's gotten a lot better. But to start out, we focus on the U.S. At Picnic, but like a lot of the problems in the U.S. are common around the world. Every doctor's office and health system has an electronic medical record system. There are some that still have paper, but pretty much everyone has like an EMR at this point. And that's where the patient's where the doctor is going to keep notes, labs, et cetera, about the patient. And today, if people go to see a doctor that uses Epic, they can log into like MyChart or something like that to see their information. But those systems don't talk to each other while they're like heavily customized or like built like to a like particular doctor's like workflow, and the way that like different doctors like capture things ends up being different to how that doctor operates or how that provider operates. And so things that are done in one system don't like translate over into other systems. So when somebody moves, their records don't typically goes to a different doctor, et cetera. The records don't always follow with them. And even when they're like EMR systems that are built by the same vendor, the most common one in the US being Epic, they're like so heavily customized that data doesn't naturally like combine and get aggregated. So those are some of the technical barriers. And then there's also kind of like policy barriers that come out of a good place of wanting to like protect like patients like privacy and their right to their data, but sometimes in practice that ends up erecting barriers that would actually like result that like compromise getting better patient care. So it's a long-standing problem that there's been a lot of effort to try to fix, and traditionally approaches to it have like taken some form of like trying to do ETLs across different systems to combine data and have like rule-based approaches. And it just never worked because there is so much heterogeneity in the way that like information is stored and structured across these different systems. And there's so many systems that you have to like combine and connect. I think our estimate is there's about 400,000 like medical facilities in the US. So it's a super gnarly problem. I think it's like in the US, we spent like $40 billion on the High Tech Act, which had a primary goal of like promoting interoperability. It didn't work. Like the NHS, actually in Wikipedia, if you go to like there's like a list of like biggest software project failures in history. One of them is like the NHS's attempt to have like interoperable medical records across the UK. So that's all I'm saying. Like, things are better now than they were like 5 or 10 years ago, but it's still a big problem.
You mentioned, obviously, yeah, I think not being in the industry, we always hear about the data issues, but things have gotten better, and obviously you guys are in a spot to make things better. You mentioned something I want to go back to: the end user themselves. The patient. A lot of times, it's really complicated for us to find records, get records, even with. And I see the Epic portals now. You can log in, and that's, some of them are connected. Actually, I've had doctors go, "Oh, I saw so-and-so's notes in there." And I was like, whoa, what do you mean you saw? Oh, they're connected. I'm like, hey, really cool. But it almost seems like it's got to be happen chance that the systems are the same, that they have agreements. There's a lot of things that have to go right for us to accidentally have the benefit of that data portability and visibility. From a patient perspective, obviously we like low friction. Healthcare is already complex enough. When you think about the friction to get to records, we have to, sign documents. We have to, some people still want them faxed. We can email them. You have to drop them off in person. There's a lot of friction. I guess is removing that friction so that we get a total picture of our health. Is removing the friction a necessary step?
I think so in practice. I think that's a great, I think that's a great push. And that is, there have been a lot of people that have worked at on this problem of like passing data around. I think one of the unique ways that like we at Picnic have approached it is going first from a like patient perspective, and how do we make it easier for an individual patient to get all of their records? Like you said, there's like a ton of friction. When we first started the company, it was basically like we would do just all of the work that an individual patient would have to do on their own for them. So we do a lot of like faxing facilities, like calling to like follow up on like where like those record requests are, like trying to create normalized versions of all of those different forms that someone would have to fill out to get their records released, so that they could just, sign one for us in an easy way in an onboarding process, like coming up with ways to be able to like discover and identify where an individual patient has actually had care. There's no like master record of like where someone's had care across all the different facilities. And so it is a super hard problem. And I mean, in practice, I think when there is friction, it means that people just like won't do it or won't use it. And so then like there are, and I think in healthcare that has like can have really real adverse consequences to outcomes. I think that focus on having like a low friction experience is really important. There are many historical interoperability approaches that rely on like patients even today, some of the like more advanced like capabilities to like provide an app connectivity would require like a patient entering credentials every time they want that app to be able to pull data from different systems. And that's just like a very high level of friction that like people, relative to like most consumer experiences, that people just aren't going to do. And so then in practice, even though it's like technically a mechanism for there being interoperability, no one's going to actually use that. So I think having things that like don't just in theory work, but in practice work because they are low friction is really critical for actual usage.
As you're talking about, and we're discussing the friction within stuff, I think I think all humans pretty much friction is the deterrent for most of us. I mean, heck, rebates exist because they know the friction of filling out the rebate form means that some percentage of people will be enticed but never actually receive that money, right? I mean, I think that's just part and parcel. I guess there is a component of, patient ownership here, the friction that you're talking about, but also, we're seeing data improve. You mentioned some of this data is improving, and we do have technology that has obviously shifted, changed in the last 20 years, let alone the last 3-4 years. I guess when you're looking at AI and its role within this particular area of data collection, what is the impact? What is the role that AI is playing within this narrow view?
In medical record collection, go back 10 years ago, to get like records in between systems, basically to rely on 100% like stuff getting faxed around, and we would fax out places, get like documents faxed back to us, would run OCR, do things to like structure it, et cetera. Starting like the order like 4 or 5 years ago, there started to be like a lot better and more available interoperability or data access between systems. They weren't always like lined up, but you could request, providers and patients can request records like electronically and get effectively there's particular types of XML files back. But then once you have records, and so for us today, about like half of the core like data that we can get is accessible electronically, and the other half kind of has to fall back to getting like PDFs that are e-faxed around, and that fraction is changing, but it's still real. Once you have that data, it's all in like somewhat different forms. It doesn't like line up apples to apples. Even stuff that in theory is like electronic and structured, like there are different flavors, you'll call it in the space, like different flavors of HL7. HL7 is like one of the underlying standards bodies in healthcare. And so even if you're in theory like aligning to a particular version of that standard, you'll have like a different flavor at different places. So combining that information in a deterministic way is very hard, potentially. Like, I think it's never worked in practice. And so like to be able to actually do it uniformly across systems, I think is impossible. But AI gives you a way to be able to reason and like structure over data where you don't need to have these kind of like deterministic pipelines. So, I mean, places where we use it is in like documents that come in, like assigning them to like labeling them as the visits that they are from, the facilities that they're at, the patients that they're for. Going from there, breaking those documents up into different sections. Like a medical record will have like a medication section, a history of present illness, a like lab test results section, identifying those different sections. Then within those sections, extracting and structuring data. So like in a medication list, like getting out all the meds in there, the dosing, et cetera. And then we also do what we think of as like an abstraction step. So it's like combining information across different records into like patient level representations. That using medications as an example, not just like saying like this is in a medication list at this particular visit, but let's look at all the times that you've like there are references to that medication in like notes, in lists, in like the pharmacy dispense information and prescriptions, and combine that into a representation of like you were taking this like drug from like time A to time B. So that pipeline is like necessary. I think some form of like that kind of pipeline is necessary to go from these source records into like a unified representation of the patient's data. up until a few years ago, our approach at Picnic to that was like we were building models for like each of these different stages and like training models for choosing the right architecture for our like document labeling model or our segmentation model or our classification model, and doing those on like a one by one basis. With the rise of like the emergence of like LLMs, we've been able to shift to an approach where we can fine tune a base model on different types of tasks, but it's the same base model. And that's improved both actual performance on those tasks where we're able to like take advantage of like improving like base model capabilities and have like some transfer learning across the different types of tasks we're fine tuning to, and really simplified development, where instead of like, having to deal with like 20 different models that we're training, being able to train one model to do a bunch of different task types. But broadly, I think that kind of work of like combining information would not be possible without machine learning AI broadly, and then it's become much more tractable to get like very powerful results more recently.
And obviously, I think that's actually great insight in terms of how the process works. When you look at the sheer volume of data, and then obviously, most importantly, accuracy, right? I mean, this is data that is of a lot of significance, making sure that the data is accurate. And when you start talking about machine learning, AI, and what kind of oversight there is to make sure those results are accurate. I guess first question is, when you look at the volume, is there something? Obviously, we don't want you to give away trade secrets, but when you do look at volume, and that is a concern, and that is something that's different within the space. I mean, similar to fintech, there's a lot of volume when you start applying these advanced technologies. How do you grapple with that, or how do you deal with that, rather?
You mean like volume of data to work with, or to sheer volume, and obviously the real question is the accuracy of the applied AI to it. Yeah. Well, I think the volume of like medical data, while significant, is smaller than volume in other fields. File sizes often get inflated because when you have like imaging files, like those are very big, but the actual like text content of records is not like quite as big as other fields. But like in our we published a paper on kind of like our core model at the end of last year, and so no need for worrying about trade secrets around that. We have about 350 million annotations on medical records that we've used to like fine tune our. We fine tune Llama 3 to get our like foundation, our like the LLM that we use for like many of the different medical record understanding and interpretation tasks. And while it's a lot, it's also like less than other places. So it's not, I think in the time when we were training, we had similar things that other companies ran into in terms of GPU availability and stuff like that. But like it was nothing that was too insane. On accuracy, I think accuracy is accuracy is something that's like really important. It's important generally, but it's incredibly important in healthcare. What we take a like multi-tier approach. I do think in any discussion of accuracy, it's important to ground to like what is the threshold, like where are you trying to target, and like obviously like perfect is ideal, but in a lot of spaces, like getting into a definition of perfect is really difficult. Like where we work in like medical record, like labeling and abstraction, there aren't like really gold standard data sets to use. And even when you create like a gold standard of accuracy, when you're getting like experts to do things, like you're choosing like what level of expert, like, like some experts will disagree on like particular pieces of information, like how things should be coded. So generally what we find as like a useful threshold to use is like as good as an expert trained human to train to. And so, I think in the way we worked, like initially we had done a lot of things like manually, and we're collecting a lot of labels that we could then use for training. And so the threshold that we use for our models, in terms of like, is this good enough, is like, can we beat in accuracy our like trained abstractors? Now that, we do by like measuring like precision recall, and like you can like kind of like tune how we're trying to optimize like across those and in the training process. We layer on guardrails around having like both like general and disease specific like plausibility and conformance rules. So it's like making sure there isn't anything that just like doesn't make any sense. Like, someone who weighs 5,000 pounds is like, an example of like that kind of thing. And so we can like both put in like specific ones for like diseases that we're working in, and ones for like, general health with some generic outlier detection to identify cases where something might be wrong. And then in addition to that, we build in having auditing for like random samples that are audited to like check model accuracy for like drift over time. So it's really kind of the combination of those like three things is how we approach it. Of like, one, tuning it to like an appropriate level; two, adding in like rule-based guardrails to like identify any potential areas; and three, like consistently having sampled auditing. I'll also say that like, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'll let you finish your thought, please. Go ahead.
Right, well, I think one last thing here is that the level of human oversight in like an AI process should be like tuned to the context where it's being used. So our models are used for organizing, like in one context are like used to like help organize, patients' records so that they can like navigate in a portal. In other contexts are used to produce data that's going to be going to like the FDA or like a regulator for like deciding like, should this treatment, just deciding on like the approval or like label for like some treatment. And in data going to the FDA, we like configure things so that even though we have like, AI like doing structuring, making predictions, everything is reviewed by a person. I mean, there's other places where it's just not going to be feasible to do that. So, I think the question of accuracy, while it like seems like at a high level conceptually straightforward, ends up being like quite nuanced in how you approach it.
And I guess just one follow-up question to that. You mentioned, kind of the standard to which you guys are working against it. And I think when I speak to people that are working within, the AI space, there's a question that always comes up that I find fascinating. And that really is, a lot of people have this image of holding AI to an exceptionally high standard compared to humans. And my personal story with medical records is I had hip labrum repaired. Insurance got approved, and a year later I got a bill, and they're like, no, we actually ended up denying it because this fax is going back and forth, didn't work out. It was insane that it was all a bunch of fax work, and somehow they were able to track back these faxes and then get everything got resolved. And when you're talking to us about, the amount of data, we're talking about the accuracy, I look at that as an example of when people start looking at ML and AI solutions sitting on top of data and worrying about, is the AI going to be, or the ML solution going to be accurate enough? Will it make mistakes? And then it's like, we're humans. We're making mistakes 24/7. You just might not question it because you're not doubting it, or you just don't know what to know or not what to look for. But how do you deal with, I guess just that, because I'm sure it's got to pop up when we talk about applying AI to a data set.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that you're right that like people kind of are used to, computers and like software working deterministically. So like if something goes wrong, then it's like wrong, or it's like not good enough. But I do think in AI and ML, it's a different standard where, I mean, A, it doesn't work deterministically. So it's not like if there's a single mistake, it means that it doesn't work. And, B, in a lot of cases when we're trying to see like, how can we, alleviate repetitive, like burdensome work that people would be doing and have like AI do it, really the threshold is like, can it do it at least as well as like the person would be doing it? Or even if it can't do it as well, can we then have the right kind of like validation or like guardrails or like systems to like kick out to like a person when necessary? I think in our case, two things to note. I think one, a lot of the work that we do within research, that is a context where we can put everything like for final review in front of a person most of the time, just in terms of like the cost structure of like having like a person like review AI output is still like can be like far more efficient than like a traditional model or like a traditional approach. And so it's easy for us to kind of like stick to the within that kind of level of comfort that people have of like a person looking at things, even in places where like AI is going to be operating at like a better, like higher level of performance than the human reviewer. That is changing over time. Like the FDA at the beginning of this year in like January released draft guidance around how to use AI. Does take into account like what is the appropriate level of like validation and use. And so it's like, I think people are coming around to that there. On the side for patients, I think one thing that's been interesting for us is that, we've been doing like machine learning in some form for a long time when we would have called it like ML and not AI. I actually think that people's familiarity with like with like AI assistants like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, etc., has made people like the general consumer kind of more understanding of like non-deterministic behavior in terms of like getting things like, okay, these things hallucinate or like they get things wrong. And so, we've had a bit of an opportunity of like in places where like we have AI working where it's, working very well, but it like, we'll occasionally get like some things wrong in the same way that a person will sometimes get things wrong. Being able to think of it as an agent, like almost gives like more forgiveness from like a consumer's perspective to those kind of like mistakes that would have been harder to explain when there was like less familiarity like 4 or 5 years ago. So I don't know. I mean, I think people still do have that kind of like unreasonably higher standard. Like when you look at like Waymo, where their like crash rate is 1/10, accident rate is like 1/10 of like what human drivers are, and like people still worry about it. It's I think a classic example, but I think it's getting better, and people are getting like maybe closer to like thinking at in a way that, okay, we should be judging these things based on how they do compared to human, not compared to some level of perfection.
I agree with you, and I think sometimes people in comfort and adoption are slower than sometimes the pace of technology. I guess final question, and I'm curious because you just said something that made me think and wonder. You mentioned FDA guidance on AI, and I'm not well versed in this, so obviously I am kind of curious. When you are seeing the last several years and the growth of AI, how does that guidance reflect the speed of just change and innovation within the industry? And obviously the FDA's got a very important role. They need to safeguard, but AI is moving really quick. Kind of curious what you've kind of noticed in terms of the two together.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak specifically to the FDA guidance, but then also kind of like regulatory approaches more broadly. And healthcare is a space where I think if you're crafting regulation, there's kind of a trade-off between being specific and then and like the benefit of being specific being that then people have like, okay, this is clearly what I have to do. But the downside of being specific is that it's like likely to become outdated or like incorrect, like quickly, or be very general and kind of like vague. And that then has more longevity in terms of like regulatory guidance, but can sometimes be more frustrating for somebody like trying to build within it, because like, well, I could do like 12 different things that like fit within this kind of like regulatory guidance. And I think in healthcare and the FDA, they've kind of learned to be in that more like, okay, we're going to give like general guidance category, but not give like specific, like highly specific requirements. And so, you know, I think when you look at like, if you looked at this FDA guidance, like they give some examples in there which are helpful, but the guidance is in the like, you have to evaluate like the context of use of like AI. You need to find like a mechanism for like testing it and like validating it. They give these like 7 specific steps, but they kind of align to these like general principles of like, okay, you should be making sure to do like these things, but don't say exactly how you need to do them. You know, when regulation veers into like being very specific about how you need to do some things, oftentimes that's where it can get outdated like super, super quickly. And I don't know, think about the various AI bills and things that tried to like put a restriction on a certain number of like floating point operations like per that went into model training, and that's like a threshold. That's a sort of thing that like feels like it becomes outdated very quickly, or you could like just be choosing the wrong thing to focus on, and then you'll end up with these kind of like perverse negative incentives that'll cause weird behavior.
Well, Troy, I thoroughly enjoyed speaking to this topic. I think it's interesting, and I think there's going to be a lot of overall benefit and good for people once we actually have this holistic. I actually was taking a look at your website the other day, and I was like, it's kind of cool that you can get a perspective of your health that gives you all this information, insights to what's happened and what potentially could happen. And I think it's something that we don't have. So you guys are, you know, definitely got a great mission, and it sounds like an amazing journey ahead. So thank you for taking the time. If somebody does want to learn more, has a follow-up question, maybe even a technical follow-up question, what's a good way of connecting, asking that question, you know, et cetera?
You could reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm Troy Astorino there, or on X, also Troy Astorino there.
Okay, fantastic. We'll definitely make sure people are directed to those links. And again, thank you for taking the time. I really did appreciate it. That's it for this show. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, 2 things. I think Troy came on, talked to us about, you know, some of what's happening within the medical record space, some of the challenges. Obviously, we mentioned some things have improved over the last several years, but still challenges out there, and how PicnicHealth is actually tackling this and the benefits to the consumer. And we talked about, you know, accuracy and perception of AI accuracy, and got a little bit of FDA in there. I think we probably could have gotten into a lot more of the model discussion, and maybe we'll have to have Troy on for a part 2 and share this episode with somebody else who has interest in health tech about how your medical records could benefit from this type of technology. And I'd really appreciate that. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.